I'm always fascinated when I get a chance to hear what people say about the olden days. Remember the good old days? The good old days. I especially love to hear them when it comes to churches, I really do. I find it fascinating, especially when I hear stories of how churches got started. Especially here in California, it was actually very fascinating. As a church planter, I think it's neat to see what has happened in the past. What they used to do was they would gather Christians in our tribe, Lutherans, and they'd gather together for a rally. And once they would gather together, they would sing, they would worship, they would read scripture, and then they would pass the plate. And after they passed the plate, they would take that money and they would say, this is enough for us to start a new church 5 miles down the road. And then after a while, they would do the same thing again. They would gather everyone together. They would say, we need to do another church plant. They would pass the plate. They would sing. They would worship. And then they would start another church. It was amazing because this is a wonderful way to help bring people together for a common mission and a common vision. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was really excited about him being a church planter, and he was, again, quite successful according to most metrics because he was in the fastest growing area in Arizona. And let me tell you, his church got really big, really fast. I remember hearing about all those, and I started to think to myself, what's happened? Why are things so much different nowadays? Why is it so much harder? There seems to be a challenge that has come over the church in America that prevents us from somehow finding the successes of the past being realized in the present. I know that for a lot of churches, especially over COVID, everything changed. There was a lot of responses of, well, how are we going to manage this? How are we going to survive this? Because we have all the stuff that we have to do to try to change. We still have to take care of our people. And then the big questions started hitting all of the churches. What do we do about ministry to the community? I think community ministry has been something that is starting to be in a resurgence now. And it's kind of exciting to watch. I know that not everyone does this. There are churches all over America right now, often in the Midwest, that maybe doesn't understand a little bit about the levels of diversity, especially we have out in the coasts, especially out here. And you can hear story after story of small rural churches struggling to find out what to do because everything's changed. As they look at their neighborhood and their community, the people have changed. As they look at the new restaurants that are being built, they have flavors that we don't really understand. When we go to the grocery store, all of a sudden we're starting to hear languages we don't even comprehend. And sometimes that can be a very scary thing. This Lent, as we have joined together with a couple of other churches, we're going to be doing a series called Lent for All Nations. It is a reminder to us about how the gospel story, and specifically the days leading up to the crucifixion and through the crucifixion, was God's pouring out of love upon the people. And it wasn't just his chosen people. It was his chosen people, but it was more than that. Throughout the Old Testament prophets, through the stories of who Jesus even encountered, we get the opportunity to see how God continues to reach out. And what he's calling, I think, for me especially, as I was very excited when this was the series that was chosen, because I believe Searchlight can learn a little bit from this. I believe that we can try and figure out, what do we do about all nations? In the olden days, what did we do about international ministry? Well, it was rather simple, right? We would gather an offering, and we would send it to a missionary overseas. And that's how we did international mission. Everything has changed. You do not need to go overseas to do international missionary work anymore. Now, Searchlight still does, and I'm very excited about that. I'm very happy and I'm very pleased about that. But here, especially in Fullerton, in Orange County, with the churches that we are a part of, we see international mission happening every day. We see people that don't talk like us, that don't speak like us, that don't dress like us, and oftentimes don't even worship like us. And we have before us the opportunity to understand what it means to be a light to the nations. As churches have faced these challenges, there's always a reaction of what do we do? And churches have had to struggle with this not only through the years, but accelerated also through COVID. What do we do with all of these other people? It was easy before because we would start a church. All the people that walked like us and talked like us and dressed like us and worshiped like us gathered together. It was big, it was successful, but we were never really doing a great job of reaching out to the others. And now, as the great American melting pot continues to get stirred and more diversity comes in, churches are being challenged with the nations. So we have some options ahead of us. Some churches decided to circle the wagons. It's very simple. We have a piece of property and we have a building. And the most important thing that we can do is preserve this for as long as we can humanly possibly do. And as we do that, it will be hard, it'll be difficult because we'll see people slowly get older and older and then eventually die off, and soon there will be no one left in the church. But at least we kept it pure. Some people just simply get angry. I've heard pastors, as they reached out to other groups, go, yeah, I just don't know if I really like those people in my church. And the moment you start talking like that, you are no longer a welcoming community to anyone who darkens your door. And then it's easy to get angry at them for the demise of the church. They are ruining everything. They are taking all of my resources. They are taking everything that was exciting for me and easy for me, and now everything is so hard, and I blame them for destroying the church. There's lots of reactions we can have. During the prophet Joel's time, they had a similar problem in front of them. Joel is a quick little prophet, an easy little read, and it's very fascinating because in it has some very important words that I think will be very appropriate for us, but for some context. The Israelite nation had enjoyed a lot of success. They had had so much influence in the world. Everywhere they went, everyone knew the Israelites. There was a time when even Moses' father-in-law had heard through the grapevine of how powerful God was because of the Exodus. As they were going into the promised land and going into Jericho, everyone was shaking because they knew how powerful God was. They knew that he could do almost anything. And that this group of people that were wandering through the wilderness were not to be trifled with. There was no way they could even be touched, really, because of the God that they served and the God that was with them. And so after they had enjoyed quite a bit of success going through and doing whatever they wanted, they started resting and relaxing and saying how wonderful they are amongst the nations. But as time went on, as the people started to stray, they became a scorn. They became a byword. I don't really understand what a byword actually is, but it seems to be something bad. It's no longer in a privileged position. And it sounds a lot like today's church. Is the Christian church today the one that people turn to when they have a problem in their life? Many times it's going to be doctor, psychiatrist, counselor, a trusted friend. Churches are on the decline. How about how we should raise our children? That's been relegated to other people, to professionals, to leaders that will take and teach, and the church is not really trusted with that as much. How about moral issues? Church isn't looked at all for moral issues. In fact, we're often laughed at. We're often scorned. This is the exact same scenario that we have in the book of Joel. And so Joel was going to speak to them, to give them some words, and I'm telling you, these words are absolutely perfect for us today. Because we've got to ask ourselves the same question. What do we do? How do we live? How do we minister? Some will say, let's just return to the good old days. Let's just do things the way we did them in the past. Let's just circle the wagons and preserve our resources. Let's just get angry. And then, of course, the latest trend, let's get political about it. And God has something very important. From Joel chapter 2, he gives us 3 things for us to do. Even now, declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Return to God. Not return to the good old days. Not return to what works before. And by the way, I'm very conscientious of this. I often think of my amazing church planting abilities and the great successes that I've had. And oftentimes it's tempting for me. And I'm sure some people are going to say, why are we going back and doing that? Why are we not seeking God? And I might say, let's return to what works. And I hope everyone then looks at me and says, how about we do Joel chapter 2 and return to God? It's not about what we think politically. It's not about our emotional reaction to what we see happening around us. We return to God because God is the one who loves us and all nations. If we find ourselves straying, if we find ourselves being angry, if we find ourselves looking at other people judgmentally, the best thing for us to do is return to God. And when we return to God, we should then rend our heart. Verse 13. Rend your heart and not your garments. Return to the Lord your God, for he is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love, and he relents from sending calamity. Rend your heart, not your garments. It's not about an outward demonstrative act. It's about what's happening on the inside. And then Joel does this refrain, which is the number one description of God in the Old Testament. God is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in love. Jonah had the exact same difficulty. We know the story of Jonah. We know that he was tasked to go preach to all nations. And, of course, not just any nation. He was to go to the capital of the Assyrian Empire, the absolute dreaded enemies of the Israelite nation. And that capital city was Nineveh. And it's interesting because Jonah doesn't want to go. And maybe we wonder, why doesn't Jonah want to go? Maybe Jonah just hates Ninevites. Maybe Jonah's just angry at that group of people because they are invaders. They are ruthless. They are barbaric. Maybe he just doesn't want to get caught in the middle of that. And you know the story well enough. He's swallowed by a whale, spit up on shore, and then he goes and he preaches to the Ninevites. And what he sees happen is nothing short of a miracle, which is something I think all of us look to when we think of preaching to all nations and reaching out to all nations and ministering to all nations. He declares this truth about God, and everyone repents. And at that point, Jonah was the most wildly successful evangelist at the time, for an entire capital city of the dreaded Assyrian Empire had converted. And of course, Jonah was happy. No, he wasn't. Jonah was not happy. Jonah was angry. And he goes up onto a mountain and he's overlooking and he's really hoping that God will destroy the plains that are down there, and he's hoping that fire and brimstone will come, and it doesn't. And what does he say? He says, God, I knew it. I knew you were too nice. And then he gives this refrain. I knew you are a God of grace and compassion. You are a God who is slow to anger. You are abounding in love, and I knew you were going to forgive them. I think Jonah forgot where he came from. I think Jonah forgot that at one time he was an outsider. I think we in the church sometimes suffer that same problem, do we not? We forget of God's grace to us, so we are not very gracious unto others. I know that, especially when I first started church planting, I think I was probably characterized as an angry pastor. Paul's laughing because he still thinks I'm an angry pastor. I'm just kidding. Sometimes I can get a little bitey, and most of my ire starting off was against people who were so stuck in the past that they couldn't see the ministry opportunities in front of them. And what I needed, most importantly, was to return to God and to rend my heart, because I had forgotten where they had come from. I'd forgotten where I had come from, and I'd forgotten where I was going to be ending up too myself. We return to God. We rend our heart, because if we do, we have this promise of God being gracious and compassionate, not just for all the people out there, but more importantly for you and for me, because boy, we sure need it. I think sometimes we fail in the church to give the grace to ourselves as much as we would give it freely to other people. And we hear from Joel when he says, who knows, he may turn and have pity and leave behind a blessing, grain offerings and drink offerings for the Lord your God. And then he calls us back to worship. We return to God, we rend our hearts, and we worship our God. Blow the trumpet in Zion. Declare a holy fast. Call a sacred assembly. Let's get together and worship. Gather the people. Consecrate the assembly. Bring together the elders. Gather the children and those nursing at the breast. Grab them all. Old, middle age, college, youth, preschoolers, babies. Grab them all and worship together. Let the bridegroom leave his room, and let the bride leave her chamber. Let the priests who minister before the Lord weep between the temple porch and the altar. let them say, spare your people, O Lord. Do not make your inheritance an object of scorn, a byword among the nations. Why should they say among the peoples, where is their God? We have the opportunity today and every day as we wake up and do ministry out into this world. We will be quickly attracted to those who look like us, talk like us, dress like us, sing like us, and worship like us. It is a natural tendency within us all to gather amongst the people who are most like us. But God says that is not the only place where I give my blessing. My blessing is to those on the outside. And we can and should continue to reach out to all nations. And I love how so many churches are now waking up to this fact. I hear stories of churches, rural churches who are creating missionary spots inside their church for people to be able to come train and then work in the community. I hear of churches that are close to universities that are saying, how can we reach out to those weird, strange college students? They are bizarre and smell funny and stay up way too late. How do we reach out to those little ones who have not yet heard of Jesus and their parents so that they can also receive the grace that is given to them? We rend, we return, and we worship. And we will watch what God does. Over the next several weeks, we will be traveling from church to church. I do invite you next week, if you live in the state of California, people who are stuck here because of the storms. We're glad you'll probably still be here next week. You very well could be. Week to week, we're going to be moving. Next week, we gather at Zion Lutheran Church in Anaheim, and you are invited all. Come 6 p.m. Bring some. No, they're going to provide food and eat all their food and see their place, and then listen to Pastor Tim Eaton, who also has a heart for missions, a heart for ministry, who will then be taking us through the next step in the journey of Lent for all nations. And it is a reminder that as we then see God's love poured out through his death and then through his resurrection, we then will eventually hear the great words that Joel spoke in Joel chapter 2, verse 28. When he made a promise that was fulfilled in the most amazing way. And it reminds us too that God's Spirit is not just for us, but it is for all. And afterward, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days.